Did you see this thing take off?
One of your showboat tricks, Mr. Douglas.
I tell you, I had nothing to do with it. Hey, we were turning.
When Disney and McDonald's first collaborated to bring the world the Szechuan sauce, promoting the release of 1998's Mulan, they would not have expected the outrage and uproar from a group of ravenous teens nearly 20 years later, calling for the re-release of this precious sauce again. As the sauce found interest and value with an entirely new demographic, it became what we will call as a floating signifier. Now, a floating signifier is a semiotic or physical object that can retain its autonomy, formally, while still absorbing any number of meanings and valuations. Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French anthropologist, introduced the term and provided the word oomph as an example to describe any number of types of flavor as it applies to food. Oomph is never associated with a particular type of flavor or explicitly quantified, but you know when food has some good oomph. In this, the word signifies something that a great deal of people, at least colloquially, can understand the implied meaning, but at the same time never actually agree on that meaning. This is known as the floating signifier, but for the sake of this series, we'll call it an empty vessel. Now, over the course of an indefinite number of episodes, because it's hard to say how many of these I'll actually want to do, but as I move through these, we will explore a number of objects that have originated and or translated through media in some way, and through this process have over their lifetimes become empty vessels. Objects that can take on any number of values from various sources and yet still maintain a form of autonomy. For this first episode, we'll look at the Volkswagen Beetle, tracing its history through different media realms, as a material object and then as ashes in its afterlife. What may or may not surprise you is that the Beetle originated as part of a pre-World War II Nazi initiative by the KDF, which stands for Kraft durch Freude, meaning strength through joy. They did this to increase domestic tourism and travel around Germany. The KDF was a branch of the German Labor Front, and they were tasked with the promotion of leisure and travel for the German citizens. It utilized propaganda campaigns to instill these values in the populace. However, much of the KDF's initiatives, including the Volkswagen Beetle, were suspended with the instigation of World War II and Germany's invasion of Poland. The term Volkswagen is translated as the people's car, is perhaps an empty vessel itself. This idea and even the term were found in several car designs preceding the design of the Volkswagen Beetle and even the VW company. Although Hitler, a former art school student, is often credited with the Volkswagen's design, stemming from a napkin sketch that featured the iconic rounded hood, many stylistic qualities of the car were preceded over a decade or more earlier. The Hanomag 2-10 was built between 1925 and 1928 and served to fill the people's car role as a cheap, reliable vehicle that would be accessible by a large portion of the population. The Hanomag also featured the rounded profile and some degree of the Beetle's cuteness, acting as a spiritual ancestor. Additionally, the phrase Volkswagen was first used in 1934 by the Standard Company, describing their vehicle, the Superior, which by all means appears rather standard. However, the Superior does feature the iconic tapered, rounded rear end that is so prominent on the Beetle. And additionally, a few others in Germany were exploring designs that would also feel rather similar to the Beetle's. Edmund Rumper designed numerous rear-engined streamlined cars, and Joseph Gans designed a few for Adler, as well as the Standard Superior, that featured the scarab-like designs iconic to the Beetle. And finally, Mercedes-Benz also designed a few rear-engine models, the 130H and the 170H. All these elements ended up combining into a design soup that would instill a series of formal and conceptual values as inspiration for the first iteration of the Beetle. And in 1938, the design that would become the Beetle was formalized by Ferdinand Porsche and Erwin Komenda. Now, following its design in the late 1930s, the propaganda machine was initiated to physically bring the car to life. The first material production Ready Beetle premiered at the Berlin Motor Show in 1939, fatefully only a few months before the German invasion of Poland that sparked World War II. However, in the lead up to the show, the KDF had already begun the stamp book campaign that would serve as the revenue generation for the Beetle's production. In these stamp books, German people could put away 5 German marks per week for one stamp, for a total of 4 years in order to afford the purchase price of a Beetle. This campaign was bolstered by an inundation of propaganda pieces that doubled down on the idea of the accessible car used for leisurely travel and family outings. These campaigns sold the car as an icon for the mobility of the German citizen and their capacity to occasionally escape labor. On occasion, a citizen should be mobile enough to travel and take in the pre-designed KDF tourist attractions. The Beetle was the image of this hopeful mobility and escape. The propaganda materials virtualized the fantastical idea of getting away, supplanting the more traditional propaganda aesthetics that were focused on labor and duty. But the car itself was the media object that would afford this new way of life for each German citizen. Now, in the years leading up to World War II, the KDF established an entire company town named Stadt des KDF-Wagen bei Fallersleben, translated as City of the KDF Cart at Fallersleben, for the production of the Beetle. However, with the breakout of World War II, the factory was transitioned from Beetle production to that of German military vehicles, such as the Kubelwagen, using various parts and souped-up Beetle chassis. Even still, a few Beetles were produced and gifted to mostly high-ranking military officials, such as Hitler himself and Emperor Hirohito of Japan. Because of this production transition, most people who had weakly invested in these stamps towards the Volkswagen never received their car, and after the war could only use those stamps as a small down payment towards the car. This money was likely just directly funneled into the German war effort. So, while this has been a rather lengthy synopsis of the Volkswagen Beetle's origins in Nazi Germany, at this point it is important to distinguish that the car's first life as a virtual, highly designed element of propaganda, and that for the average German citizen it never really existed physically. The empty car was filled with the idea of the Volkswagen, that it could be the people's car, and that it could be a liberating object, and had enough oomph to convince the German people, amongst a myriad of other things, that their weekly investment would eventually get them a car. This value was determined by a governing body, who instilled those values in the car and then pushed that onto the German citizen. The irony is that the vehicle designed, at least in name, for mobility and freedom, was just as highly designed and regulated as the workplaces, places of leisure, and every other aspect of the German people's lives. Although maybe removed 1 degree from being explicitly obvious, the car's design was premised on regulation, control, and perfection, and just happened to be wrapped in a cute, accommodating form. Now, following the end of World War II, the British took control and restarted production at the Volkswagen factory. And after a few successful years, the control of the factory was handed back to the German people. The company town was renamed to Wolfsburg. During this time, the financial success of the Beetle was contingent upon rapid production and exports well beyond the German border. And with this, the car was introduced to the United States. Now, at the time, America was wrapped up in an over-the-top advertising campaigns and consumerism frenzy following the celebratory return of its GIs from World War II. The personal vehicle had become an expression of this fever and helped birth the cultural myth of the American dream. Your car, your house, your television, and your family. All these you deserve following your service. The vehicle designs of this time played into the myth of the American dream through increasingly exuberant designs, including overly expressive tail fins and sensuous Dagmars. These elements were in no way utilitarian, but rather a manipulative expression of the country's abounding wealth. As metrics like miles per gallon were not widely used, auto executives sought a way to market their cars. They looked to superfluous artificial difference, and the tail fin was born. It symbolized the concept of speed rather than providing really any functional advantage. This artificial difference in the tail fin led to planned obsolescence in the eyes of the manufacturers, who were keen on turning the American car into a hot fashion item, not unlike a suit or a decorative kitchen appliance.
Mr. Jones and Miss Fleur were neighbors. They each had $3,000. With his money, Mr. Jones bought himself a $3,000 car. With his money, Mr. Krempler bought himself a new refrigerator, a new range, a new washer, a new dryer, a record player, 2 new television sets, and a brand new Volkswagen. Now Mr. Jones is faced with that age-old problem, keeping up with the Kremplers.
Now, as freedom rang free for America in the early 50s, the notion of the car as a liberating object for mobility would not take hold in the U.S. as it had in pre-war Germany. The VW had to set itself apart from the dominant mode of advertising by presenting a radical, though soft, alternative. And instead of offering increasingly flamboyant and extravagant vehicle design, VW offered something no one knew they wanted. The Volkswagen was marketed on its simple reliability and ease of maintenance. It never introduced the planned obsolescence that each new model of Cadillac would, with bigger fins, deeper Dagmars, and more chrome. Now, as we can see in this 1958 Edsel campaign, the typical ads were increasingly focused on superfluous details and the car's sleek styling. It displays the car as a singular object in the landscape, while the individuals inside are obscured behind the sleek profile and beautiful colors. The ad talks about the Edsel as an entity approaching you from behind, and your eye catches it in the rearview mirror. It is the most beautiful thing that has ever happened to horsepower, and it steals the show wherever you go. The long, clean, powerful 1958 Edsel. The car had become a vehicle for the individual self-expression of wealth and status. However, Edward Bernbach's Think Small campaign, which rather obviously borrowed by Apple 50 years down the road for their Think Different campaign, offered an entirely different and fresh perspective for the Beetle. Gaining a new kind of autonomy, it showed a car that jumped off the page and exuded its own personality. It did not mess around with subtle symbols and chrome-domed fins. Instead, it was bold, with in-your-face, cheeky copy and simple, accessible graphics. The car sold itself often without any human beings in the image. It was never really seen as a moving object or with much of any exterior context. It was ironic and spoke directly to you. In this, it became an autonomous object and not a vehicle for your own self-expression. Of course, if you were Wilt Chamberlain, maybe you cannot fit into a VW, but it understood this. Its cute face always assuring you of just what you needed from a car. Enough legroom for almost anyone's legs, enough headroom for almost anyone's head. I am just about enough for everyone. Even if I do not look great, I will fulfill your basic needs, and sometimes, due to my affordability, I can help provide even more. Although not something fashionable, I am a practical choice. The VW found a voice without any decoration or flourish. It held an insane honesty and a self-deprecating tone that was well before its time. A truly postmodern concept. As VWs continued to sell in the U.S., the values of the car began to shift away from those the advertisement men prescribed and towards the values of those who drove the car. This advertisement from the 70s clearly lays this out. The Volkswagen was known for its reliability, and when the time came for repairs, if you had a basic set of tools, anyone could be their own mechanic. This design philosophy meshed well with the hippies' rejection of labor divisions and penchant towards primitive subsistence. This meant that a community, not wanting to deal with a professional car servicer, could fix the car themselves. They would not have to worry about parts being expensive because it mostly used the same parts from year to year. As it stayed around for so long, it became a member of your family, associated with your family's values, not just a lawn ornament. And it became aware how these values associated with it were rapidly evolving. Now, it is important to point out that the personality of the Beetle was not entirely consumer-driven. In 1968, Disney released a movie called Herbie the Love Bug. This movie solidified the iconic cute little car's nickname, Bug, and its nature as a truly autonomous being. The VW Beetle was not chosen as the car to star in the movie until it won out a competition among a dozen other cars. And would you have it, out of these 12 other options, the Beetle was chosen because it elicited the crew to reach out and pet it. Throughout the film, Herbie performed several rather human-like actions, clearly portraying its own personality. Now, the movie was a bit of a hit and spawned several sequels that continue to feature the car's uncanny personality. As VW sales to the US increased through the 60s, Volkswagen looked for expanding markets, and the Beetle's primary manufacturing hub moved from Germany to a new plant in Puebla, Mexico. Following this plant's opening, Volkswagen quickly began exporting to both the US and even Europe, and later in 1978, the production of the Beetle in Germany was ended. As the US became the main consumer of Beetles, it made sense for manufacturing to move to a place that would offer lower shipping and production costs for the Beetle. However, following the oil crisis in 1973, the US locked down on vehicle emissions, and in 1977, the classic air-cooled Beetle was banned in the US because of failed emissions tests. However, during the period from the late 60s and onward, not only was that Beetle produced in Mexico, but it was also driven there fanatically. And by 1989, the Beetle accounted for over 40% of the overall share of passenger cars on the road in Mexico. And with a new location and a new context, the Beetle again absorbed a new set of values, and even today are still evident in the country. Folks talk of the friendly-faced Beetle that was always around and never gave out as multiple generations grew up driving the same car. But perhaps more interesting than its place as the family car in Mexico is that the Beetle found a new use as a commercial cab. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, and even somewhat until today, Mexico City was swarming with Beetles, made at the factory just a 2-hour drive away. And this usage scenario certainly made sense. Naturally, a car known for its superior reliability and affordability lent itself well to commercial cab use. The Beetle, although never intended to be a cab, functioned pretty well as one. However, you do need a certain type of society for an import to find itself in a commercial use like this. It requires a modest developing economy that would see the Beetle as a necessity. A more developed economy would likely commission a domestic company to design a function-suited vehicle. So, the vehicle that was once marketed to the purview of the individual as the perfect family getaway or road trip car now found itself seated as a commercial, urban, start and stop and start again courier. But this transition did require the superior build quality of the Beetle. However, this same build quality would lead to a parallel problem for the Beetle. By the late 90s and early 2000s, it had garnered a dangerous reputation among its riders. As this two-door design offered no escape for a passenger in the backseat, a would-be assailant could force themselves in through the passenger side door and attack and rob those inside. As this sentiment came to a head, the Beetle quickly fell out of public opinion as the go-to for commercial cab use, and sales of the classic Beetle began to decline. The social effects of design decisions made so long ago cannot always be predicted, and sometimes those effects can feel rather bizarre. When the Beetle was mapped to this value as being a cab, it did not fit quite perfectly. And it seems that all forms, even the Beetle, have a determinate range of function. The form of the Beetle here did not fit specifically to what the object was used for in this case. Cab drivers and cab companies did find the Beetle useful, but so did the thieves and robbers. The thief saw a different value in it, thinking to himself how useful as a tool the Beetle is for robbing people. A mentor shared the anecdote from the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. In this, an indigenous individual in Africa picks up a glass Coke bottle that has been tossed out of a plane. He finds this bottle to be magical and mysterious. He then travels on a bizarre journey to try to return the object to the gods. The Coke bottle became much more to this person than it ever could have been to whoever tossed it from the plane. It held a great degree of withdrawn or latent value or meaning for the one who found it discarded and picked it up. The Coke bottle was designed to have control in a particular way. Rationally, you should drink from the bottle, then return it back into the stream for recycling. Instead, this bottle found itself outside the realm of its rational use, and this opened up an entirely new understanding of it. Similarly, when the Beetle was used by the thief as a perfect tool, it became continually removed from its intended rational, controlled use. The vehicle that was designed by the Nazis to exert a great deal of control, fatefully, moved well beyond their perspective of its timeless image. By the late 90s, Beetle sales declined across the board, and Volkswagen devised a plan to reinvigorate the car, and in 1998, they introduced the new Beetle. The new Beetle, however, was a mimic of the classic design and was built on a VW Golf build. While this Beetle featured a few iconic elements from the classic Beetle in terms of its overall form and eye-like headlamps, it rejected the rear engine and was much wider, far flashier, and more luxurious than the original ever was. The decision to alter the car's physical build quality marked a major departure in the Beetle's value system. The manufacturing perspective had shifted from reliability and ease of maintenance to the overall look, feel, and aesthetic associations. Although heavily marketed on the coattails of its predecessor, and following some initial success, the sales of the new Beetle, unfortunately, were only relatively niche. The new Beetle was not nearly as cute as its predecessor, and the car was no longer that quirky family member that finds itself living in your garage, but instead was an ominous imposter. Then, in 2005, perhaps as a homage to the production of the last classic Beetle in Mexico in 2003, Disney reintroduced Herbie in Herbie Fully Loaded, starring the classic and iconic Beetle alongside Lindsay Lohan. While this movie was not exactly a box office hit, it returned to the classic cliche of the Beetle personified, and to its detriment doubled down on that trope.
Forget about the bug and win the race!
You're going down, Bug.
Trouble in turn 4! Murphy into the wall and upside down!
Okay, Herbie, you ready? Keep it steady.
There's no place to go! Look out for the crash! Herbie! Herbie's on the fence! Herbie's on the fence!
Unfortunately, the shtick felt tired by this point. As plenty of other personified objects had graced the screen, it no longer really felt original. The value for the Beetle had again shifted, as those that grew up with the Beetle had grown up. As the classic Beetle's production ended and the new Beetle was introduced and Herbie returned to the screen, it became apparent that a new value had emerged to be placed inside the bug. We call this nostalgia. Unfortunately, preying on nostalgia would only take the Beetle so far, and while the classic Beetle design had stuck around for decades, the new Beetle form would only last 13 years. In 2012, an updated new Beetle was introduced and continued production through Mexico. The shape felt a little more contemporary and sporty, but still failed to include the material values that the classic Beetle championed. The updated new Beetle was now twice removed from its source material. Too much luxury was coupled with a lack of reliability and traditional material values. And to make matters worse, in 2015, a day of reckoning came for Volkswagen, as they tumbled into the Dieselgate scandal. This again called into question the values that they had supported for so many years. Beetle nostalgia played its most recent tune, though, in 2018's Transformers movie, Bumblebee, as the main character was a classic bug. In this movie, the Beetle is a lovable and affectionate alien, transforming at will from car form to robot. The Herbie movies may have thought they went to the edge by cutting their car in half, but Bumblebee takes the physical deconstruction of the Beetle to ever greater heights on screen. In this movie, the material quality of the car, though, is preserved as a reliable, trustworthy teen's first car. The car's fix-em-up spirit is central to the movie's themes about liberation and escape, and hopefully this will not be the Beatles' swan song. Although finally, in 2019, the last of the new Beetles rolled off the line in Mexico. But the Beetle was essentially dead in 2003 with the final production of the classic Beetle. These new cars were only ever cheap simulations of the original classic design. As I have mentioned, the play to nostalgia here never reproduced the actual classic Beetle. Each time the Beetle was introduced and reintroduced into the public realm, whether through media or some other source, it was done so with a new set of values. This time, however, that value was all in on nostalgia, and for the most part, that nostalgia ripped the car of its physical qualities that had before led to its mobility across cultures. The period from the late 90s through 2010 showed us how important the physical Beetle was to its continued existence. Today, though, plenty of people still own a Beetle and consider them a part of their family, and like the hippies in the late 60s, are something that exists for their own modification. Each time someone memes the Beetle and turns it into their own design, they are granting it further and further autonomy that the new Beetle design never understood. The new Beetle was too polished, and by introducing a planned obsolescence and way too many features, it failed to be the all-accepting canvas that the classic Beetle always was. The classic Beetle's form was iconic and something to be played with. All you had to ask of it was for it to steer and go forward. There are today shows and events for people to show off their modified classic Beetles. The lists for the different fantastical ideas embedded in the classic form are endless, but you'll not often find a new Beetle among these. People have found fun ways to immortalize the form in video game modification as well. Also, throughout the years, other companies tried copying the Beetle's production and distribution model with varying success. Take the Yugo, for instance. Maybe a similarly cute car, small and cheap, but it lacked the accommodating form and sheer reliability that the Beetle provided. Because the Yugo was plagued with mechanical failures and difficult maintenance, the Yugo gained a reputation known not for its autonomy and cuteness and modification, but rather as a challenge just to keep the thing running. You could never make a monster truck version of the Yugo because it would fall apart just driving on its own. However, an example of a successful icon might be the Jeep, a US-based car with a similar historical timeline as the Beetle. Originally, the Jeep was founded as a military utilitarian vehicle for traversing rough terrain, but this is a very, very specific use case, affording a very specific formal design. While the Beetle's original values were formed in just driving around and transporting people reliably across the country, the Jeep's initial values were a bit different. And over the course of history, those values really have not changed that much, and when they have largely been rejected by its core audience. The Jeep maintains its simple iconography and form, but those are not quite as accepting as the Beetle's. Neither the Jeep nor the Yugo began their lives as a media object. Because the Beetle started its life as an icon for a particular set of values, its utility was a result of its physical design. For the Yugo, the design was to be sold to the US like the Beetle. For the Jeep, the design was to move troops across rough landscapes. For the Beetle, its design was to be a car. It had no specific function but just to drive. Because of this, it has taken on a myriad of values over its life, and as it does each time, the true value of it is enhanced. The Beetle is a blank canvas, an empty vessel, capable of absorbing a continually evolving set of values. And as it does this, the car becomes increasingly autonomous to the point that even the death of its production or its unsuccessful cloning has not really killed it. As the Beetle found itself in different places throughout history, it often fit in for different reasons. In the 30s, the Nazis designed a car that they thought would be the best solution to mass mobility. It would be the perfect rational machine, the people's car, a timeless icon. They designed it as a virtual object that posited the potential to escape day-to-day drudgery. They, however, never put the car into production, and their values, and even those of Ferdinand Porsche, were eclipsed as the car became successful following the war. The car and factory were seized by the British and used to aid the post-war German rebuilding effort, introducing a new set of values. Then, in the US, it happened to be a cheap, affordable, functional, and refreshing new face amongst the overly audacious vehicles offered at the time, filling a role that ran counter to all the other commercial options. In Mexico, it was a great way to answer a commercial problem, but the cab drivers were not the only ones that saw it commercially viable. Then, again, the US and elsewhere, it found a new exploitation, the myth of the comeback, but it never really came back as it sacrificed its core values. And with each example, as the car found new places to exist, it simply just happened to afford a different use each time. While those that had designed the car thought there was a rational and correct ideology that the car should be a certain way, the fact that it found itself in so many places, doing so many different things, explicitly refutes that platitude. The qualities of the car were never fully realized by the Nazis, or by the United States, or Mexico, or even those that meme with it today. The car can continue to be used in any number of unexpected ways. For this essay even, I am using it as an object of critique. The Beetle became autonomous because we can never really define it explicitly. It's not just a Nazi-designed car, it's not just a cab in Mexico, and it's not just some weird turtle modification. It is such a great example of an empty vessel because it affords all these different uses, and through this affordance, this little bug drove into the hearts of so many. Thank you. Goodbye.
But I never forget a car. I like good machinery. Now, why don't you give this little car a fair chance? You bought it. Enjoy it. You can drive me back now.
What about it, Dad? Want to give that doodle bug a workout? I'll go easy on you.
Be serious, will you?